Hey everyone, welcome to Laratips. PHP 8.2 has already arrived and there are so many things added to this version. In this video, we'll be looking at read-only classes with practical examples. So let's get started. Currently, I am here in the online php.io website where we can check multiple versions of PHP. Here, I am checking for PHP 8.2 and 8.1. As you can see here, I have written here this class, the normal user class, and there are two read-only properties, name and email. And this is the constructor where I am assigning and just creating a new user object with name and email, and I am just dumping it out. This thing works on both PHP 8.1 and 8.2. If I execute the code, then you can see here it is running perfectly fine. But in the latest version of PHP, which is 8.2, we have read-only classes. We can do here read-only like this, and now we don't need to write this over here. We can easily remove these two, which means that if we want all the properties of our class to be read-only, then we can use this read-only. We don't have to write read-only multiple times on the properties. Now if I run this code, then it will work perfectly fine for PHP 8.2, but on 8.1 it will throw an error. And this is not the only thing that is related to the read-only class. There are also some other things that are tweaked in this PHP 8.2 version. Now if you just see here, if I try to assign a value to a dynamic property, then also it will not allow us. So let's say here user password equals to wow, then it will give us the fatal error, which means that we cannot create a dynamic property user password in the PHP 8.2. So you cannot assign a value to a dynamic property on the read-only class. Similarly, the other thing that you need to know is the read-only doesn't work on the enum traits and interfaces. Let me show you over here in the enum. I have this user type enum, and if I run the code, then it will work perfectly fine for 8.2 and 8.1. But if I write here read-only like this and execute the code, then it will give us the syntax error, which means it doesn't work for the type enum. Similarly, it doesn't work for the trait. So here if I write read-only and execute the code, then it will again give us the syntax error. Similarly, it doesn't work for the 8.1 as well. And for the interface also, if I write read-only over here and execute the code, then it doesn't work. Also, one thing that you need to worry about whenever you are using a trait with a read-only class is that you cannot use a trait with a non-read-only property on a class that is read-only. So here a class user is read-only, but the user name trait has a public or any kind of property that is non-read-only. And if we try to execute this code, then it will give us an error saying that read-only class user cannot use a trait with a non-read-only property username name. And now let us look at the final thing on a read-only section is that you always need to have a typed property whenever you are using read-only class. Okay, now here if I say public password like this, and now let me just remove this thing from here. So you can see here the password doesn't have any type. And now if I just execute this code, then you can see here read-only property user password must have a type, which means that it is very strict. You have to add a type over here. In the PHP version earlier than 8, it already included the scalar types like integer, string, boolean, and in PHP 8.0 we had union type, by which we could return multiple values from the same function, and it was also possible to return false or null in the union types, but we couldn't use false or null as a standalone type. But in the latest version of PHP 8.2 it is possible. As you can see here, this is the union type over here, and either we could return an integer or float. Here I am returning float, and let me execute this code. Then we can see the float over here in both PHP 8.2 and 8.1. And here we could also combine, let's say, false like this, and I could also return false like this. And if I execute this code, then it would work perfectly fine for both 8.1 and 8.2. Similarly, we could also do here return null, and we could do here null and execute this code. But if we only wanted to return either null or false, let's say only null over here, then this wouldn't work. Here you can see in the 8.2 it works, but in the 8.1 it would return the fatal error. Null cannot be used as a standalone type. Similarly, it is not possible for the false like this. Return false, And let me execute this code, and here in the result it works for 8.2 and doesn't work for 8.1. And similarly true also works over here. Let's say true over here and execute the code, then 8.2 it works, and in the 8.1 it doesn't work. But if you try to use true and false like this, then it will throw an error. So here if I try to execute the code, then it will say that type contains both true and false, bool should be used instead, and this is a fatal error. Instead of this we can use bool, and if I execute the code, then it should work perfectly fine, which means that using true or false is only for one type of return type, not for both true and false. Similarly, there is also one thing in the 8.1 that wasn't working. So let's say here int or float or false, it was working previously. So let me comment this out and execute the code. Then it was working on PHP 8.1 as well. But if I just try here true over here and return true and execute the code, then now it works on the PHP 8.2, but it didn't work on the PHP 8.1. This thing is also solved. So we can now use true, null or false as a standalone type as well in this PHP 8.2. Also we can use true in the union type. In PHP 8.2, now there is a way to hide some sensitive parameters in backtraces. Here you can see a simple class, a user class, which has a name and password. Password is very sensitive information over here. If I just execute this code, then you can see here nothing is happening. But if there is an error whenever we are trying to initialize this user, let's say throw new exception error like this, and here let's say new user Laratips and password is, let's say this is a very secret password. And now if I try to execute the code, then here in the back traces you can see this information over here, that this is the name and this is the password. And let's say if we are logging this information in a third-party services, then the password of the user will also be sent through the API, which means that if there is a security leak, there is high chances that other people will get access to the password of our users. In order to prevent such scenario, there is a new attribute added to PHP version 8.2 by which we can hide this kind of information. And the attribute name is sensitive parameter. Here, if I just write that parameter over here, this hashtag, and inside the square bracket, we can write backslash and sensitive parameter. After this, if I execute the code, and if there is an error over here, then we'll actually get the sensitive parameter value over here instead of the actual password. So using this feature, you can securely pass the data to the third-party APIs whenever you are logging your backtraces. In PHP 8.2, now we can add constants to the threads. Currently here I have written a code that is compatible to both PHP 8.1 and 8.2. We have a trait user type. Here we have a string type property, and here is admin, which is returning boolean. And here I am just checking if the type of the user is actually self-admin. But if we look here inside this trait, we haven't this admin constant because it was not possible to define a constant on a trait in the PHP version earlier than 8.2. For that, I would have to define that constant on the user where this trait is being used. And this is kind of funky because suppose let's say we didn't have this constant on the user where the trait is being used, then this would blow up and you can smell something wrong going over here. And this code totally works. So here if I try to execute isAdmin on the newly instantiated user where I have returned type equals to admin, then it will check this admin, this one to this one over here, and then it will return true. If I execute the code, then you can see here true for both 8.1 and 8.2. But now instead of defining this constant on the user class where the trait is being used, I can actually just cut it from here and add this over here, and it should work perfectly fine. So here if I go and execute the code, then it works perfectly fine for the PHP version 8.2, but it will throw a fatal error on the previous versions of PHP, and it says traits cannot have constant. Setting a dynamic property on a class object is now deprecated in the PHP version 8.2. You can see here the class user, it has only one property name and it's Laratips. And here I have created a new instance and assigned last name as the last name. And you can see here the last name is not present on the actual user class. So it is a dynamic property. Now if I try to execute this code, then in the latest version of PHP, it will show me the deprecation message, but it will actually work. And from PHP 9 onwards, it will throw error. It is deprecated in 8.2, but works perfectly fine on the PHP 8.1. But if you don't want this deprecation message to show and want it to work exactly like PHP version 8.1, then you can actually write an attribute over here at the top of the class, which is this allow dynamic properties. After you do this, it will work as 8.1, and if I run it, you can see that there is no deprecation message over here. And also let me show you one more thing where the deprecation will not show. Let me just run it one more time and you can see this deprecation message, but here instead of writing user, if I just write here user equals to new std class, and for this std class it will not show the deprecation message. Here you can see that it doesn't have any warnings over here, and it works the same way for both PHP version 8.1 and 8.2.